A little girl was on the verge of losing her life. Doctors had given up, medicine had failed, and her family was left with no hope. But just when everyone thought it was the end, a German shepherd, her doctor's faithful companion, did something unbelievable. What happened next left even the most experienced doctors in shock. Stay with us until the end, because this story will touch your heart. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The hospital hallways were eerily silent, carrying an unbearable weight of sorrow. Dr. Michael Carter walked through the pediatric ward, his mind clouded with thoughts he wished he could push away. Room 407, a place he knew too well. Inside, 6-year-old Lena Thompson lay motionless on a hospital bed. Her frail body barely moved, her shallow breaths the only sign of life. For over a year, she had been fighting a rare and aggressive illness. Every treatment had failed. Experimental drugs had only given temporary relief before the disease returned, stronger than before. Her parents, Emily and James, had exhausted every possible option. But now, the truth was undeniable. Lena was slipping away. Michael took a deep breath before stepping inside. Emily sat by her daughter's bedside, gently stroking her tiny hand. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights and silent tears. James stood by the window, his fists clenched, his face filled with helplessness. "Dr. Carter," Emily whispered, her voice carrying a desperate hope, as if today he might bring a miracle. But he had none. Michael swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. "Her vitals are weakening. We're doing everything we can to keep her comfortable." Emily's face crumbled as she tightened her grip on Lena's hand. "There must be something. Anything." James turned abruptly, his voice tense. "What if we take her somewhere else? Another hospital? Another specialist?" Michael shook, his head gently. "You know we've tried everything. There is no cure, James." His words filled the room like a heavy fog, suffocating the last traces of hope. Emily sobbed quietly while James ran a trembling hand through his hair, frustration evident in his every move. And then, breaking the unbearable silence, came a soft whimper. Michael turned toward the door. His loyal German shepherd, Shadow, sat there watching intently. The dog had been by his side for years. More than just a service animal, he was a trained therapy companion. But Shadow had never entered a patient's room without permission. Tonight was different. His ears were perked, his deep brown eyes locked onto Lena. He whined again, shifting his weight as if asking to go closer. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Come here, boy." Shadow padded silently across the cold hospital floor. He approached the hospital bed and, to everyone's surprise, gently rested his head on Lena's tiny hand. Emily gasped. "He's never done that before." Michael frowned, watching closely. Shadow remained still, his body unusually tense. And then something happened that sent chills down his spine. Lena moved. It was subtle, a faint twitch of her fingers against Shadow's fur. But after days of complete stillness, it was enough to take everyone's breath away. Michael rushed to check the monitors. There was a slight increase in her heartbeat, a flicker of life where there had been none. Emily clutched James's arm, her voice trembling. "Michael, what does this mean?" I don't know," he admitted, his voice unsteady. But Shadow did. The dog let out a soft sigh, nuzzling closer, his warm breath brushing against Lena's skin. Then, for the first time in weeks, Lena's lips parted. A whisper. "Shadow." The room went completely still. Emily covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. James staggered back, gripping the windowsill for support. Michael's heart pounded. This wasn't possible. Lena hadn't spoken in days. She had been unresponsive, her body growing weaker with each passing moment. Yet here she was, reacting, speaking, living. No one could explain what had just happened, not science, not medicine. But one thing was certain. Shadow had done what no treatment ever could. Lena had been slipping further into unconsciousness, her fragile body barely clinging to life. But now, something impossible was happening. She was responding to the touch of a dog. Shadow let out a soft whine, gently licking her tiny fingers, his tail giving the faintest wag. Michael watched in stunned silence, his mind racing for a logical explanation. Medical science had failed her. Every treatment had been exhausted. And yet here she was, stirring at the presence of his faithful companion. For the first time in weeks, Lena showed a sign of life, and it was all because of Shadow. The room remained frozen, in disbelief. Emily sobbed into her hands, her entire body shaking as she witnessed the miracle unfolding before her eyes. James wiped at his face, too overwhelmed to speak. Michael, a man who had dedicated his life to medicine and reason, found himself questioning everything he had ever known. Shadow remained pressed against Lena's side, his warm body curled protectively next to her frail form. His head rested on her tiny hand, his deep brown eyes locked onto her, as if he understood something no one else did. "Lena," Emily whispered, inching closer. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Lena's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing, once slow and weak, had steadied slightly. She didn't speak, but her fingers twitched against Shadow's fur, just enough to prove this wasn't a dream. Michael stepped forward, eyes darting to the monitors. A slight improvement in her heart rate. It wasn't drastic, but it was undeniable. A change had taken place, one that had no scientific explanation. "This doesn't make sense," James murmured. "They told us there was nothing left to do. But now, she's reacting." Michael took a slow breath. It's possible that Shadow's presence is triggering something in her brain, an emotional response that's affecting her vitals. Emily lifted her tear-filled eyes. "Do you think she recognizes him?" "She must," Michael admitted. "Therapy dogs have been known to help patients recover, but this is beyond anything I've ever seen." Shadow let out a soft huff, as if confirming Michael's words. This dog had always been more than just a companion. He had worked alongside Michael for years, comforting children, bringing hope where there was none. But never, not once, had he reacted this strongly to a patient. Michael knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze never leaving Lena's face. Then, without hesitation, he gently nudged her hand with his nose and looked up at Michael expectantly. It was as if he was guiding them. Michael hesitated before carefully taking Lena's frail hand in his own. "Lena," he said gently, "if you can hear." Me squeeze my fingers. The room was silent, the kind of silence so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. Then, ever so faintly, the smallest pressure. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. James inhaled sharply, his whole body shaking. Michael's chest tightened. "She's responding," he whispered in disbelief. Shadow let out a quiet, satisfied sigh, curling closer to Lena, as if protecting her from whatever force had been pulling her away. Michael checked her vitals again. There were no sudden miracles, no drastic shifts, but there was life where there had been none before. And in medicine, even the tiniest step forward meant hope. Emily pressed a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead. "We're here, sweetheart. We're not going anywhere." Michael turned to the parents, knowing he needed to say something. But what? That this was a miracle? That somehow, against all odds, this dog had done what medicine couldn't? Instead, he simply said, "Let's not move him. Let's see what happens if he stays with her overnight." James gave a wordless nod, squeezing his wife's hand. Michael reached out and stroked Shadow's back. "You knew, didn't you?" The dog didn't respond. He simply rested his head against Lena's hand once more, as if he had never doubted her survival. Michael stayed in the room, watching the girl who was never supposed to have made it this far, and the dog who refused to leave her side. For the first time in weeks, he believed she had a chance, and it was all because of Shadow. The golden light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, casting a soft glow on the sterile white walls. Michael rubbed his tired eyes as he stood beside Lena's bed, scanning the monitors. Something had changed. Her oxygen levels had stabilized. Her pulse was stronger. The labored, uneven breaths that had haunted them for weeks were now steady. Emily stirred in her chair, exhaustion evident in every movement. But the moment she looked at her daughter, her breath caught. "Lena," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Lena's eyes fluttered open, and this time she smiled. Lena's eyelids fluttered weakly before slowly, hesitantly, opening. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her breath catching as if she was afraid to believe what she was seeing. Across the room, James, who had been slumped in exhaustion, jerked upright at the sound of his wife's broken sob. "Lena?" Emily's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with both fear and desperate hope. The little girl blinked sluggishly, her lips parting slightly. She was still pale, still frail, but there was no mistaking it. She was awake. Mommy. That single word shattered the dam of emotion Emily had been holding back. A strangled cry escaped her as she collapsed onto the bed, clutching her daughters. Tiny fingers, kissing them over and over as tears streamed down her face. James was at her side in an instant, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His hands trembled as he brushed Lena's hair back, his touch reverent, as if he couldn't believe she was really there. "You're okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're here." Michael stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of what was unfolding before him. He had spent his entire career believing in science, in logic, in the certainty of medicine. But this made no sense. His gaze drifted toward Shadow. The German shepherd sat motionless at Lena's bedside, his dark eyes locked onto her, his ears perked forward, watching intently. He hadn't left her side, not for a second. Michael crouched beside the dog, running a hand over his thick fur. "How did you know?" he murmured, more to himself than to the animal. Shadow didn't react. He didn't shift, didn't blink. He simply stayed there, completely still, his focus never wavering from the little girl. Michael exhaled, forcing himself to focus. He turned back to the monitors, his eyes scanning the readings. There was no medical explanation for this. Yesterday, Lena had been slipping away. Today she was awake, but that didn't mean she was safe yet. "Lena," he said gently, stepping closer. "How do you feel?" The little girl blinked up at him, her expression tired but peaceful. Then, slowly, the corners of her lips lifted in the faintest smile. Michael couldn't bring himself to shatter their joy, even as a deep unease settled in his chest. Shadow had given Lena something beyond comfort, beyond anything science could explain. And now a terrible thought gnawed at him. What if Shadow had sacrificed something in return? That night, after Emily and James left to get some rest, Michael remained in the hospital room, sitting on the floor beside Shadow. His fingers moved absently through the dog's thick fur, his mind racing. "You're not okay, are you?" he murmured. Shadow let out a slow breath, resting his head on Michael's lap. "You gave her something," Michael whispered, his voice unsteady. "Something we don't understand." Shadow's tail flicked just slightly, but he didn't move. Michael swallowed hard. He had spent his entire career believing in science, in logic, in the certainty of medicine. But here, In this quiet room, he was witnessing something that defied everything he knew. "Is this the price?" he murmured. "You saved her. And now—" Shadow simply closed his eyes, warm and solid against Michael's side. It wasn't just loyalty. It was something deeper, something unspoken. And for the first time in years, Michael felt completely powerless. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by their side, watching them, the little girl who had defied every odd, and the dog who seemed to be fading before his eyes. Lena had no idea. She was too busy smiling, laughing, reclaiming pieces of her stolen life. And Michael didn't have the heart to tell her what he suspected, that the one who had saved her might not survive alongside her. Shadow's breathing grew shallow. His body barely stirred. Michael ran a hand over his fur, whispering, "Come on, boy, stay with us." But in his heart, he feared it was already too late. By morning, an unnatural weight hung in the air. Lena was brighter than ever, sitting up in bed, chattering away as her parents wept with gratitude. The hospital staff called it a miracle, but Michael couldn't celebrate. His eyes kept drifting toward Shadow, unmoving at the foot of the bed. Then, in the middle of Lena's laughter, Shadow let out a barely audible whimper. Michael's stomach twisted. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, hands moving urgently over his fur, searching for something, anything to explain what was happening. "Shadow," he called, his voice tight with panic. "Come on, boy, look at me." But Shadow didn't lift his head. His breathing was labored, too slow. And then, as Michael pressed his forehead against Shadow's, pleading silently, the dog did something that shattered him. Shadow licked his hand, just once. Then with a final breath, he went still. The room froze. Emily and James turned, confusion flickering across their faces. Lena, sensing something was wrong, glanced down at her best friend. "Shadow?" She called softly, reaching out to touch him. He didn't move. Her tiny fingers shook him gently. "Shadow, wake up." Michael's throat tightened. He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. Lena's smile faltered. "Why isn't he waking up?" Emily let out a strangled gasp as realization hit. James moved quickly, wrapping his arms around their daughter as she shook Shadow harder, her voice breaking. "Shadow, wake up!" she begged, desperation thick in her cries. Michael wanted to say something, anything to make this easier. But there were no words for this. Lena lifted her tear-streaked face, looking at him with wide, desperate eyes. "Dr. Carter, what's wrong with him?" Michael swallowed against the lump in his throat. He had given bad news before, had been in this position countless times. But this was different. "Lena," he said softly, his voice barely steady. "Shadow saved you." She sniffled, confusion flashing in her eyes. "But I'm better now," she whispered. "He's supposed to be okay too." A sharp pain stabbed through Michael's chest. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her small shoulder. "Sometimes," he murmured, "when someone loves you enough, they give everything they have, even if it means they have nothing left." Lena shook her head, her sobs coming harder. "No, he was supposed to stay. He was supposed to be with me." Michael closed his eyes. "I know, sweetheart. I know." But Shadow was gone, and the room that had been filled with joy just moments before was now suffocating with grief. Lena collapsed onto Shadow's still body, burying her face in his fur, her sobs shaking her small frame. Emily knelt beside her, stroking her back, silent tears streaming down her face. James stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw locked as he watched his little girl's world shatter. Michael could hardly breathe. He had witnessed loss before. He had delivered painful news more times than he could count. But this wasn't just a dog. Shadow was the reason Lena was alive. And now, he was gone. Lena's tear-filled eyes searched Michael's face, her voice trembling. Why did he have to go? Michael knelt beside her, his voice soft but steady. Lena, he didn't leave you. He gave you everything he had. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Her small hands clung desperately to Shadow's unmoving body. I don't want that. I just want him back. Her cries cut through the silence of the hospital room, raw and filled with a grief far too heavy for someone so young. Michael's heart clenched. He wanted to take away her pain, to offer some kind of explanation that would make this easier. But how could he explain the unexplainable? Shadow had done something beyond logic, beyond medicine. He had saved Lena, and in doing so, he had given up everything. James turned away, rubbing a hand over his face, his body tense with barely contained emotion. Emily held Lena close, whispering soft reassurances, though her own shoulders shook, with silent sobs. Michael gently rested a hand on Lena's shoulder. He loved you more than anything, Lena. And love like that, it never really disappears. Lena sniffled, her gaze dropping to Shadow's still face. His fur was as warm and soft as ever beneath her trembling fingers. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. Her tiny hands shook as she wiped at her tear-streaked cheeks. Will he be waiting for me? She whispered. Michael swallowed, the lump in his throat. I think he'll always be with you, sweetheart, no matter where you go. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she leaned forward, pressing a final, lingering kiss to Shadow's forehead. I love you, she murmured. Shadow didn't stir, but somehow, it felt as if he had heard her. Michael turned away, grief tightening around his chest like a vice. Shadow had been more than just a dog. He had been a friend, a protector, a miracle. And now he was gone. But his sacrifice had left behind something priceless, something no one in that room would ever forget. The hospital had never felt so silent. The beeping of machines, the hum of fluorescent lights, none of it mattered. The only sound that truly existed was the quiet sobs of a little girl who had just lost her best friend. Michael stayed by Lena's side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. There were no words that could fix what had been broken. Some losses left wounds too deep to ever fully heal. Lena ran her fingers through Shadow's fur one last time. He's still warm, she whispered. If he's still warm, he shouldn't. Be gone. Michael closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself before answering. Sometimes, love lingers, even when the body is no longer here. Lena looked up at him, confusion mixing with sorrow in her red-rimmed eyes. But why? She whispered. He made me better. Why couldn't he get better too? Michael had no answer, no medical explanation, no logical reasoning. Just a terrible, aching truth. James cleared his throat, his voice rough with grief. Lena, Shadow was special. He didn't just love you, he saved you. But he didn't have to go, she whimpered. He was supposed to stay with me. Emily brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's damp face, cupping her cheek with infinite tenderness. Maybe, in a way, he did. Lena sniffled, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. Emily turned to Michael. You said he gave her his strength. Michael nodded. I believe he did. Emily placed her hand over Lena's heart. Then maybe he's still here inside you, keeping you strong. Lena hesitated, then slowly placed her own hands over her chest, as if trying to feel what her mother was saying. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, at last, she whispered, Will he miss me? She spoke in a whisper, her voice barely, holding together. Michael, despite the grief weighing on him, managed a small, reassuring smile. I believe he'll always be with you. Lena sniffled, wiping her nose as her tiny fingers clutched Shadow's fur for the last time. With slow, deliberate movements, she pulled the blanket over his still form, just as she had done countless times before when they had curled up for naps together. "Can we bury him somewhere beautiful?" she asked, her voice fragile and trembling. James nodded solemnly. "We'll find the perfect place." Lena turned to Michael, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "Will you come too?" A lump formed in his throat, but he forced himself to nod. "Of course, sweetheart." She gave a small nod in return, her fingers tightening into fists as if trying to hold on to the last piece of shadow she had left. His memory. The burial was quiet, filled with a sorrow that words couldn't express. James and Emily had chosen a peaceful resting place beneath the sheltering branches of an old oak tree. The towering giant stood watch over a field of wildflowers, where the sunlight spilled across the earth in golden waves. It was a place of warmth, of safety, somewhere Shadow would have loved. Michael stood beside Lena as they laid him to rest, his heart heavy with loss. She clutched a single red rose in her small hands, gripping it tightly as though letting go would make everything real. She was too young to fully grasp the permanence of death, but she understood what it meant to lose something, someone you love. Slowly, she bent down and placed the delicate flower atop the fresh mound of earth. "Goodbye, Shadow," she murmured. "Thank you for saving me." Michael felt his chest tighten, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He rested a gentle hand on Lena's shoulder, offering silent comfort as best he could, even though his own heart ached. A soft breeze stirred the branches above, rustling the leaves with a hushed sigh, as if the world itself was whispering a farewell. Michael took a deep breath and lifted his eyes to the sky. Goodbye, old friend. Days turned into weeks, and life continued moving forward, though Shadow's absence left an emptiness in their hearts that nothing could quite fill. Michael visited Lena often, checking in on her health, making sure she was still strong. And she was, stronger than ever. But the sadness in her eyes never fully disappeared. One afternoon, he found her sitting beneath Shadow's tree, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes held something new, peace. "You were right," she said quietly. Michael frowned slightly. "About what?" Lena placed a small hand over her heart. "He's still here." Michael felt his breath catch. A lump formed in his throat, and he swallowed hard before nodding. "Yeah, I think so too." A real, genuine smile spread across Lena's face. Michael sat down beside her, the warm breeze ruffling his hair. "You know," he mused, "I think he'd want you to be happy." Lena nodded, her expression determined. "I will be, for him." Michael let out a soft chuckle and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You're a brave one, Lena Thompson." She looked up at, and in that moment, Michael knew. Shadow's sacrifice had not been in vain. Lena was alive, and a hero like Shadow would never be forgotten. Some stories simply touch the heart, but others carve themselves so deeply into the soul that they leave a mark forever. This was one of those stories, a tale of sacrifice, of love beyond reason, of a bond so powerful that it defied medicine itself. And like all things too beautiful for this world, it came at a cost too painful, too unfair. Shadow was never just a dog. He was never just a companion or a protector. He was something more, a guardian, a silent warrior who had seen what no one else could. When science had given up, when doctors had accepted the inevitable, when even a mother's desperate prayers seemed to go unanswered, Shadow had known the truth. He had felt what no machine could detect, had sensed what no human mind could comprehend. Lena had been slipping away. There had been no cure. But Shadow had found one. Not in medicine. Not in sterile hospital rooms. Not in anything that could be studied, replicated, or explained. He had given her the only thing he had left, and in doing so, he had saved her. It was something deeper, something beyond the reach of science. Love. A love so pure, so selfless, that it asked for nothing in return yet willingly paid the ultimate price. A love that did not hesitate, that did not question, that simply gave. When Shadow curled up beside Lena, resting his head against her frail little hand, he wasn't just offering warmth. He wasn't merely comforting a child teetering on the edge of oblivion. He was giving her something greater, something no doctor could prescribe, something no machine could generate. He was giving her life, and it worked. A girl who had been slipping away opened her eyes. A child who had been given no hope whispered a name. A heart that had once been weak found strength. Science labeled it an anomaly. Medicine refused to explain it. But the truth was simple, undeniable. Shadow had saved her. But in saving her, he had sealed his own fate. At first, the signs were barely noticeable. A little more fatigue, a slower step, breaths that grew heavier with each passing day. No one wanted to see it. No one wanted to believe that the very force that had pulled Lena back from the brink had, in turn, drained something vital from him. But Michael knew. He saw it in Shadow's eyes, once bright and full of life, now dull and weary. He felt it in the weight of his movements, the strength that was no longer there. Shadow hadn't just been lying beside Lena that night. He had been replacing her. A life for a life. And when the moment came, when Shadow took that last soft breath, understanding hit like a crushing wave, drowning everyone in grief. Lena, the little girl he had fought so hard to save, didn't understand why he wasn't waking up. She couldn't comprehend why, after finally being given another chance, she had to say goodbye to the one who had given it to her. How do you explain something like that to a child? How do you tell her that the one who loved her most, the one who had stood between her and the darkness, was now gone? Michael tried. He told her Shadow would always be with her, that love like his never truly fades. But what comfort was that? To a 6-year-old burying her best friend? What solace could that bring to parents who had watched their daughter heal only to see her heart shatter? The world had already been cruel to Lena. It had given her a burden no child should bear, stolen. Time no family should have to lose. And just when it seemed she had won, life reminded her. No victory comes without sacrifice. Shadow had saved her. But the world had taken him in return. His grave beneath the great oak tree stood as a silent testament to the cost of love. A hero, laid to rest, gone but never forgotten. Lena sat beside that grave, whispering his name, trying to hold on to the warmth of his fur, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And Michael, a man who had always believed in logic, in medicine, in things that could be explained, found himself looking up at the sky, wondering if somewhere, somehow, Shadow was still watching. Because heroes like him, they don't just disappear, they live on. In the hearts they saved, in the love they left behind, and in the tears of a little girl who would never forget the dog who gave her everything.